Hello, you crazy YouTubers. I'm a useful idiot. And remember, unlike so many others out there, I deal in conspiracy fact, not conspiracy theory. And today's a good day to say that because I looked at a couple of very interesting interviews with this former leader of Al Qaeda, Sheikh Nabil Nayam. And I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But he is the historic leader of Islamic Jihad in Egypt. Was involved with the assassination of Sadat and an attempted assassination of Mubarak. He moved to Pakistan with Zawahiri, the supposed former leader of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And he moved to Pakistan with Zawahiri to begin a group with Osama bin Laden. So he was in on the beginning of this jihadist group. Of course, the name Al Qaeda came later and was a label created by Western intelligence sources. But I just wanted to add that. He moved to Sudan with Zawahiri, along with other so-called Al Qaeda members, and then he ended up getting arrested in 1994 and jailed and tortured for 10 years in Egypt. And there's a lot of credibility to this, what he has to say when you sit through these interviews. And I always want to factor in the idea that we can have agents of disinformation out there. And this would be a guy who could certainly be that. But I tend to find it fairly credible for a number of reasons. And I cross-reference some of the information I have. And in a lot of his references that all make sense and give a certain credibility to everything he said. So let's get into some of the things he said. And also I want to point out that some of the things he brings up are so specific and so logical that they also impress. And the first thing I'm going to mention is a good example of that. Talking about where do the wounded from ISIS go? And he says that the wounded are ending up in hospitals in Israel, and that we also have European staff field hospitals. And that seems like such an odd thing to bring up that it just rings with a certain amount of credence. And then he also talked about the idea that ISIS hasn't killed one American and one Israeli. And as an old school jihadist, of course, that is the paramount interest for these Islamic militants, is killing Americans and Israelis. They are the occupiers. But he rightly points out that ISIS hasn't killed either one. So his claim that Al Qaeda and ISIS are creations of the Western powers, the United States and Saudi Arabia, gets a little more traction. And this group has been founded since 2006. So it's a group that's already 8 years old, and like he points out, doesn't have a track record of killing Israelis or Americans. It has a track record of killing other Muslims, and that's one of the problems that Sheikh Nabil has, is this misguided angst and violence against the Syrian government. He says certainly the Syrian governments are infidels, but he thinks it's more important to essentially go after the puppets and United States and Israel. And he also claimed that it was even part of Zawahiri's plan to play the Shia and Sunni off each other and unleash these sectarian violences, which you'd think would not be in the interest of somebody who had a supposed terrorist Al-Qaeda agenda. And most importantly for me, Sheikh Nabil talks about the fact that so many of the so-called Al-Qaeda leaders were squirreling away millions that they were getting from their Western puppet masters. And that makes a lot of sense. That's the scenario we see everywhere the United States goes. Bribery is very integral part of this system. Look at Afghanistan. Essentially, the whole idea is not beating the Taliban, but just bribing all the warlords and paying everybody in the corrupt government, and doing it as obviously as can be. And so you can control these radical groups. And this gets it to the heart of my views about how these terrorist groups, so-called terrorist groups, are commandeered by the Westerners. That you don't have to have all the rank and file, the throng, the grunts, the foot soldiers of these Islamic terrorist movements. They don't have to be on board with the agenda. Only the leaders do. So all Westerners have to do is either run these people through the CIA or find people that are willing to sell out and give them lots of money. And then these agendas can be done, these false flag operations created, these layers of deception created just by greasing the wheels with money. That's one of the things that greases the wheels for the American empire around the globe, as we've seen. And this is not a new technique. It was used in Vietnam and every other area, Ukraine, that the United States gets involved in. So, you know, the Syria fighting against Assad seems a rather odd distraction for Sheikh Nabil, and that makes sense as well. And then one of the other things that was interesting that he brought up is that ISIS actually has a book called Management of Savagery, and I haven't looked into it yet, but I'm going to look further into it. But it apparently is the whole idea of adapting a policy not unlike Genghis Khan in military tactics and strategy and the use of terror and savagery. And so this seems to be kind of a handbook for a methodology. And as we've seen with ISIS in general, they're extremely organized on every level. The latest revelation is that there's a worldwide ISIS swag, Islamic State swag available, T-shirts and baseball hats and all kinds of promotional gear, and the fact that they have their own computer apps. They have a very slick promotion, the videos that are made, and the fact that they're using military strategies instead of so-called terrorist strategies. And a lot of this points to Western involvement as well. Very professional operation, and even posting a quarterly report. So this would also substantiate some of the things that Sheikh Nabil is saying here, and that makes a lot of sense. And one of the other things that makes him very credible is he brings up a vast knowledge of American foreign policy sources, including referencing Kissinger and talking about the 100 Years' War and talking about the Clean Break document and talking about the Project for a New American Century and the CIA. And admittedly, the fact that he does bring up those multiple U.S. sources could indicate once again that he is being used as a patsy, and he might be an agent, and he might be distributing deceptive information. But I tend to think maybe he is just educated and has had a lot of time to familiarize himself with this kind of documents. I'm always surprised at how much people in the Middle East are much more familiar with a lot of this kind of material than Americans are. I remember an interview with Iraqi citizens who knew more about the forms and structure of the American government than a lot of Americans could have told. So they're very familiar with this kind of material. And he also mentioned how the head of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood lives in Tel Aviv, Israel. So once again, this shows this way that the Muslim Brotherhood can even be utilized by Western sources as a puppet. And as I've mentioned time and time again, you only have to control the leadership and not the rank and file. And therefore, the Muslim Brotherhood can have its own agenda and have its stated public agenda, but also have a willingness to cooperate with Western intelligence interests. So we also have a confirmation that the supposed number of Islamic Front, at least until more recruits show up, is 10,000. So they have roughly the same amount as El Nusra Front, which also has 10,000. And they're all using weapons from Turkey and the U.S., paid for by Saudi Arabia, and a lot of that stuff shipped from Eastern Europe. And we also find out from Sheikh Nabil that Obama supported the Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood campaign in Egypt with $50 million. And he is an insider, so he knows. So there's some more substantiation that indeed the Muslim Brotherhood were, at least for a certain time, being used as puppets to perpetrate Western influence in Egypt. And then we also have one of the more interesting things that I haven't seen in other sources is Sheikh Nabil talks about a group that has become ISIS, or the Islamic State, that was originally a force trained in Jordan. And that really set off some alarm bells for me, because I did a video, which I'll attach below, several months ago, talking about a army or military that was being trained by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia and other bad actors in the border in Jordan, and reportedly a secular army to counter the more radical elements. But I could easily see the U.S. Mistakenly thinking they can create a secular army, or at least sidetrack everyone the idea that they're creating a secular army, when in reality they're going to be savage militants. And the idea that this force could be trained in Jordan is also plausible for a couple of other reasons. One is because we definitely see military tactics and strategy being used in the field by Islamic State, and that would seem to go in line with a professionally trained military inside Jordan. And then the other interesting part of that is that there's also an article from a year ago talking about the Saudi Arabians wanting to create their own Sunni army. And it was a proposal for Pakistan to help create a Saudi-funded Sunni army of 50,000 to fight Assad. And this was set up between, guess who? Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and United Arab Emirates. And so once again, we find Jordan participating in this, oddly, and we keep seeing these references, and therefore makes this story of a military-trained jihadi group to be sent into Syria gives it another layer of credibility. And then we also have commentators talking about this situation in Jordan with the secular army. In fact, one quote is, quote, "The Saudi effort will only serve to further polarize the rebels, and the main losers will be the current recognized leaders of the opposition," unquote. Very prophetic, since that was a year ago, and a year ago or more. And this is exactly what we see. This Saudi effort has, or ISIS certainly has, only served to polarize the rebels, and the main losers are the leaders of Al-Nusra Front and Al-Qaeda, because there's a new Big Daddy Caliph in town. And this quote goes on to say, quote, "The Saudi leadership should be careful what it creates in Syria. Muhammad's army may eventually come home to Mecca," unquote. And that's where we find ourselves now, because we find that Islamic State is now threatening Saudi Arabia. And no surprise, Prince Bandar was completely involved in the setup of this group in Jordan, and this suggested army to be created by Pakistan. And he's been involved in all the radical Islamist groups and funding and equipping them all across the Middle East. So no surprise at all that he's involved. And then we also have analyst David Kinner in Foreign Policy, which, remember, this is the journal for the Council of Foreign Relations. So generally whatever is in there, you can count on as reflecting what is actually happening. And he said that, quote, "The Saudi blueprint envisions Pakistan's military training an initial 2 brigades, around 5,000 to 10,000 men. It's not clear when the Saudis expect to deploy these forces," unquote. And interesting that, because, well, like I say, we have 10,000 original Islamic State fighters, and David Kinner is talking about what seems to be a success in creating a 5,000 to 10,000 man force in Jordan. So we see lots of confirmations that there was a force created in Jordan, that was founded by Saudi Arabia, that it was around 10,000. And then we see this relatively professional force move into Syria and Iraq in the present state we have. So Sheikh Nabil Naim seems to have a lot of credibility. The details he brings up, the references he brings up, his general specifics on all these topics. And he says that the bottom line here, which should come to as no surprise to anyone, is to create a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that's what he says the bottom line is in all this maneuvering. And I think he has a lot of credibility on that point as well. And a lot of this goes a long way in explaining some of the abnormalities and anomalies in all of these stories out there. So once again, I don't want to rule out the idea that Al-Qaeda certainly is funded by Westerners and used by Westerners as useful idiots. And there's a possibility that ISIS is the same thing. And there's also the possibility that ISIS is an experiment gone bad. And, maybe there's a little playing both sides and backstabbing going on. One never knows in these scenarios. Certainly there was a lot of warnings a year ago that that was a possibility. So anyway, if you have the time, check out these interviews with the Sheikh, and they give a lot of credence to the ideas that a lot of these jihadis are being used by Western intelligence. More confirmation. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.